Okay, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. What a great way to start my Monday, certainly. So, hello and welcome, everyone, and a special welcome to our guest of honor today, Dr. James Duffy. So, how do we find ourselves here today? Lee and I have been talking for a long time about creating something we've been calling the integral resources. A little context, Lee and I have been colleagues and friends in this integrative developmental integral world for years now. And so many people are doing so many different creative things in this world. And we wanted to assemble those useful materials, books, courses, publications, academic papers in one place as best as we could. And it is definitely a growing list, and there's probably lots that we have missed, but we've started the project. And it includes people from health and wellness, psychology, education, the environment, sustainability, leadership, governance, and more. And of course, Dr. James, that's how we found out about Dr. James Duffy, and we included him in this list. Um, Actually, prior to that, Dr. James Duffy has a podcast called The Healers Council, and you had already contacted Lee, and Lee was in that podcast. Let me super quickly share my screen and give you a quick look in case you're also interested in looking at this page. So if you go to practicalintegral.com, which is the website that Lee and I have created, and then if you click on integral resources in one of the top menu options here, then you'll see these books and publications, the academic papers, the courses, and community gatherings. And if you click on any one of them, you'll see lots of resources. Dr. James Duffy is, of course, under these academic papers. That's where we have presented Dr. Duffy's work here under integral health, environment, and sustainability. We have featured only two papers, but of course, Dr. Duffy is well published, and you can find more of his work, and we'll be adding more of his work here as well. Just a tiny bit about Dr. Duffy from me, but I think we'll have you explain to us a little bit more about your journey so far. Dr. Duffy began in traditional medicine and radiology in a very conventional way, and then moved up into neuropsychiatry and palliative care, and has played a role in palliative care when it wasn't even a thing, I believe, back in the 90s. And then very deeply, while maintaining his medical practice, Dr. Duffy also maintained a very deep hands-on practice in the contemplative arts and in the spiritual arts, and including leadership coaching. Along the way, he has championed physician wellness and focused on burnout, served in Tibetan refugee camps, and written about the integrative approaches to medicine that weave together biological, psychological, social, spiritual dimensions of healing and wellness. Last but not least, just before we started recording, Lee asked Dr. Duffy if there's something that he wanted us to mention about himself, and Dr. Duffy's response was, "Well, maybe you can mention that I'm just one who is passing through." And I thought that was really beautiful, and passing through and in the process of letting go of his biography, which felt like a really humble, beautiful note to share. So we're really excited to have you with us, Dr. Duffy, and grateful to everyone who joined us. I believe when it comes to our health, our psychosomatic bodies, as we get older, especially, it's a path with some vulnerability. And I can't think of anyone better to explore that path with than other than someone who brings this to medicine, spirit, and compassionate practice than you, Dr. Duffy. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Namali. It's a lovely introduction of Jim. And so, Jim, the first question we have for you is, when you speak about passing through, what has been your pathway from, let's say, the beginning that you were attracted to conventional medicine, and how you developed and evolved into someone with a more holistic perspective?
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Amali. Thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation. You know, I know we'll have a lot of things to talk about, and we'll just barely touch the surface. Um, I am deeply grateful for Ken Wilber's work, of course, building on the work of all of our great thinkers, mystics across time, because in my own life, as a pilgrim on a path, I have to say, in the last 25 years since I discovered the integral framework, it really helped me to make sense of where I was and where I came from and perhaps where I'm going. So, and your work and practical integral is just such an important growing resource during these times of uncertainty. As a physician, I find my sitting at self with people who are experiencing almost by definition great confusion and chaos at inflection points on their journey, whether they be physical, psychological, social, or otherwise, which leads them floundering, they feel, without any clear bearing. And sometimes my work as a physician is simply to be able to offer them some guideposts and some touching points so that they can get a sense of who they are and where they are on a journey which is unfolding in a way which is clear once we gain some perspective, which I know from my own experience the integral model helps me with. So Lee, you started by the question around my path. I I think, and of course, biographies and autobiographies, which is a whole conversation. As I look back on my own professional life and my personal life and my spiritual life, um, I look back with bemusement and some compassion. I was born into a world that was the last vestiges of a um, dying empire, for better or worse. I was born in England, but spent time in the Middle East and spent most of my formative years in what was southern Rhodesia as the last kind of bastion, the last outpost of British colonialism. Um, and as I grew up, I realized that I was feeling somewhat like a stranger in a strange land. I remember reading Robert Heinlein's book, Stranger in a Strange Land, as a very young boy, and saying, "Boy, this makes sense to me." I just couldn't find my bearings in that consciousness. But anyway, at a very young age, to go back to your question about my path, Lee, um, I experienced that I had a calling to be a healer, and that question of calling, of course, is fundamental, I would say, to anything that we manifest with authenticity in our lives. But I had a calling to be a healer, but I had no idea how to do that. I briefly flirted with becoming a priest I remember I was 12 years old. I put that to rest quite quickly, but I knew that that was something I was called to do, and I sometimes wonder if I was just an old shaman that was washed up in the wrong time plane. But anyway, as I look back on my professional career, I think it kind of laid itself out as a journey through the integral. And so I, of course, trained in allopathy. My clearly the most important thing about any calling is, in any life, really, is our intention, right? Compassion to be of benefit to others in whichever way our particular skill sets can be helpful. For me, there was really only one identifiable path, and that was into allopathic medicine, and I trained in that, and uh, and found it intellectually exhausting, if not intellectually enlivening, the amount of factual information that one had to consume was like being put into a straitjacket, a monocular. As Newton said, may God keep us from, uh, what was it, vision and Newton, may God keep us from Newton's sleep, that, put into the straitjacket of facts and materialism. And that's where I lived for many years, pursuing a career in internal medicine. In the English system, they're called physicians, and physicians always prided themselves on being quote unquote the smartest because they were the ones that were called upon to make complicated diagnoses and in complicated situations. But so I was living in that right upper quadrant, and very soon found myself becoming extremely feeling that I was being suffocated, that I would have to show up to people's bedsides with nothing other than facts that I could offer them. And I remember the day I was working in the oncology clinic and had literally 10 minutes to see each of my patients that morning, all of whom had advanced cancer diagnoses. And I would look at their medical charts, and it didn't look good. The prognosis was clear, and yet I had only 10 minutes with which to interact with them. And so they would come in often with their spouses, hopeful that I had some miracle to offer them. Of course, the medical facts spoke clearly that this wasn't something that a medical miracle could do. And so I found myself literally lying, saying, yes, we can be very hopeful. Let's look forward to you recovering, and here's a treatment that can do it for you, knowing that, of course, particularly in those days, treatments were extremely toxic and would often result in the death of patients. So anyway, I was still stuck in that right upper quadrant of the scientific materialist perspective. And I then said, okay, I have a wonderful solution to this. I'm going to live in this quadrant. I don't know what it was called in those days, but as far as I knew, it was the only quadrant I could live in as a healer. So I said, I'll become a radiologist. That way I can make diagnoses with this wonderful new technology. MRIs were coming up, and ultrasound and all these things. I said, I can make diagnoses, but not have to find myself, concerned about people's first person, well, even though it was first person experiences, but people's subjective suffering, right? So I went into radiology, and very competitive in those days, and within a few weeks knew I hated it, and was chastised by my supervisors for spending too long talking to my patients while I did barium enemas on them. So it was not a good match, but now I was in serious trouble because here I was in the right upper quadrant, and I hadn't got a clue what I was going to do next. And I really I was really in a crisis, and I really didn't know what not to do next. But I remember sitting in the back room once I declared I was leaving radiology. It took me at least 18 months to realign myself in terms of training programs. So I had a little bit of breathing space, at least a few months. And so my supervisor in radiology at that time, her name was Pam, and she and I was relegated looking at chest x-rays all day because they felt that obviously there was no future for me in radiology. I would spend my time reading Jung um, in between x-rays. And my supervisor said to me, I think maybe you should think about becoming a psychiatrist. Who else would read that kind of thing? And within that system, psychiatry was actually not part of the medical school hierarchy. It was actually managed by state system. It was actually used as an arm well, we won't go down there, but it had some dark days in the way in which it was actually utilized to impose the state's will on people. But anyway, one day I decided that I had a little break, and psychiatry used to have grand rounds, when they would get together as a department and they'd have a speaker. And so this day I wandered into this presentation, and there was this very large fellow in front of the audience, and he had an American accent, and I read that he was the chairman of psychiatry at UCLA, so a very prestigious academic appointment. I said, well, this will be interesting to have someone from outside our system talk about psychiatry. His name was Julian West. So Julian West stood up and presented his data on his work, his research with hallucinogens. And he talked about the fact that he had actually done some work with animals, and he laughed as he talked about how he'd actually killed an elephant with hallucinogens. The poor animal, very distressing to hear this, died with convulsions, and West simply said, well, we got the decimal point wrong on the dosage. Horrifying story, but I actually left that presentation not so much convinced by Jolly West's research or his attitude, but actually with this idea, my goodness, you could actually become chairman of a major department of psychiatry in America and do those kinds of things. I thought, well, here's the space within which I could actually, actually be who I am. I don't want to give hallucinogens to animals, but I could explore things beyond just the restrictions of facts. And so I did psychiatry and I loved psychiatry. But I found that although I was looking for something more than facts, my patients were being reduced to the simple metrics of questionnaires and depression scores, and the algorithm was very simple. And yet I also realized that many of my patients had something wrong with their brains, and my psychiatry colleagues weren't really that interested. And so I decided to extend the paradigm. So I'm still in the right upper quadrant here. I decided to extend the paradigm by getting into behavioral neurology, and I was very fortunate to train with the world's leading theorist or academic clinician in behavioral neurology in Boston. And it was wonderful because I felt I was learning not just the messengers, i.e. the chemicals of human behavior, but also the roadmap. And I deeply value that experience. So anyway, fast forward, I'm still in the right upper quadrant. I'm kind of stuck there, but I think I have more facts than I used to have. Actually, got some psychodynamic training, and got into trouble because I really didn't appreciate. I think Freud did some wonderful things that were contributions, but a lot of his foundational work, I think, is open to perhaps criticism and concern. But anyway, so I was trying to do some psychotherapy. And then fast forward, I ended up starting a program for people with Huntington's disease. So I met a mother of a patient whose son had died in a restraint. He had Huntington's disease. He was a very young man, and of course she wept as she talked about her grief and the loss of her son, and how the system had failed her son, and how there were whilst she recognized there was no cure, she wondered why it was, as a system, we had failed to provide him with more compassionate care, and why it was that it was only when he'd reached a crisis in his behavior that the system had responded. So, together with her and a colleague of mine, we actually started a whole process where we began to work with state government to actually begin to provide resources that would allow us to work with families and patients with Huntington's literally before they were even conceived. And of course, this wasn't a financially viable model, but what we actually managed to do was to get a new state law passed, regulations. And this provided us relatively very small amount of money. That what it did was it paid for part of my salary, and we had a small team, and we could decide how to use these resources to the service of our community and not simply the dictates of our insurance companies. And so, for example, we would work with people before they conceived a child, and there's technologies even back then that you could actually select out ovum, for example, or sperm that were carrying the defective gene, Huntington's gene. So now I'm living in the right lower quadrant of regulations and rules, and boy, it was amazing. I worked with that program for almost 10 years, and after 18 months, the head of our large psychiatric facility came to me and he said, "Jim, have you guys discovered a cure for Huntington's disease?" And I said, no, we haven't. Why would you ask that? And he says, well, we haven't seen a patient in our hospital for 6 months, so almost a year. And he says, we always had 2 or 3 people who would be admitted and we'd have no way of helping them be discharged because nobody would take them. So I could talk more about that. But anyway, it had a major impact on the quality of life. And so now I'm living in that, external world of, it's and it's and it's, and it's really great. And then I ran headlong into people, the suffering question, and I couldn't find a solution to first person suffering or group suffering in the external sector, right? And so I started getting into palliative medicine, and palliative medicine in those days didn't exist in the United States, although in England, Cicely Saunders had managed to gain some foothold in the hospice movement. And I learned by mistake, I learned this word presence. I was covering for a colleague at the hospice team, and they mentioned this word presence, and I said, "Excuse me, what is presence?" And they all looked at me and smiled and said, "Well, one day you'll understand, maybe." But it meant jumping into the left hemisphere, right, into the brain, but of the quadrants. And that will be all. Before I knew it, I was deeply immersed in the left upper experience, first person experience, and at the same time, I started becoming more engrossed, more actually found my Tibetan Buddhist connection. This felt like I was coming home. Um, so here I was in this left first person experience. And so, I always, so here I was like still neuropsychiatrist. I was still doing some modern bioethics work. Don't get me going on modern bioethics. And now had some right upper quadrant. So that was great, but it's a little confusing. And how do I survive and in the academic world? So I was able to play like, I like to think I can talk, I can bark like a dog, but I wag my tail like a dog, but I'm not a dog. So somehow I always managed to find ways to survive in academia by, talking their talk, getting grants, that kind of stuff, getting good teaching assessments, although they have not much currency value in academics these days. But, being able to program development. And so that's where palliative medicine came in. And then, of course, I got more interested in contemplative models of healing through the doorway of presence, actually. And then I found myself being pulled into integrative approaches. And one of the things I just want to say real quickly is I think that it's very clear to me that despite the limitations or the restriction of allopathic medicine to the external scientific materialist world, within the broad tent of modern medicine, allopathic medicine, there have always been these spaces where first person or interpersonal experience has somehow been able to keep a foothold. Now, that used to be psychiatry. In the late 19th century, the moral treatment movement, the idea that, if you treated people with decency and respect and you gave them good food and you gave them a community, you could actually return people to mental health, was dominant. And we still have the remnants of that in our country, in the United States. I worked at a couple of them, and I used to go up into the archives and read the log of Benjamin Rush, who founded the American Psychiatric Association, and he would describe these patients. Patient checked in on this date, delusions, monomania, whatever, and discharged a year later, healthy and returned to their families. So then that, as Freud, dreamed of this science of the mind, I mean, he really opened that door to letting go of this more, inclusive, you might say, ecological model of mental health. And we then descended into this dark time of seeking somatic treatments, materialist treatments, whether it be malaria therapy, hydrotherapy, insulin therapy, psychosurgery, all of these things. I edited a book once on this that was actually buried by my professional publishing houses because it was embarrassing to them. But I always argued that, it was necessary. The folks who were doing this, they had right intention. They wanted to help people. They just were forced to live in this world where they had to find dramatic, magic silver bullets, right? And so they tried. So when psychiatry involuted, what we saw then was the emergence of the hospice movement. Initially, it was parallel to mainstream medicine and then became integrated in palliative medicine, where and basically what characterized palliative medicine and psychiatry was that we worked with people who they were really not that desirous. The mainstream medical system was happy to hand them over to specialties of psychiatry. When I did palliative medicine, I was probably the only physician that would go into the patient's room once they'd decided that they were quote unquote, end of life or dying, and then send in the palliative medicine. So what it gave us in palliative medicine was this precious opportunity to be present to people's first person and interpersonal experiences of suffering. And it was a great, great privilege, and kind of felt like psychiatry, before the drugs and before that, it's like, analysts, they just showed up and they sat at the side of the patient. So, but unfortunately, what happened in palliative medicine was it became held hostage to the very thing that justified its existence, that we developed these financial models that showed that if you have a palliative care team, you could actually decrease length of stay on the hospital, you could decrease medication use. So those things were, for some people at least, were valuable. And so when I left my job at the University of Connecticut, I went down to Texas because it was the only other palliative medicine program in the country. That was 2005. Can you believe it? Other than the one at Northwestern with Charles Van Gunten. So I went down there, and unfortunately, what's happened is that palliative medicine now has become just another specialty, where our job is measured in terms of the same things, financial things, and now most hospices are owned by for-profit organizations. And so I found myself leaving palliative medicine for that reason, because, oh my goodness, I'm just being squashed back into, and I still had no clue about what the hell was going on. Where was I? Who were they? And then I had this, I was also, so I went down to Houston, and God had a sense of humor. He said, if you want to talk about end of life care and suffering, then work in the world's largest medical hospital. And so I was the head of palliative medicine at the Methodist Hospital, I think 1,200 beds at least. It was Michael DeBakey's hospital. Michael DeBakey was the kind of the founder of cardiac surgery in the United States. And when I arrived, there were these two massive statues in the lobby of the hospital. One of them was Jesus, and the other one was Michael DeBakey. So I think it speaks to the metaphors, the mythology of the place. And Michael DeBakey, actually, I could talk about, I won't talk about his end-of-life experience, but really, I was there around the time of his passing, and I think he was 99. But anyway, I had this opportunity to head up an Institute for Spirituality and Health. It was called the Institute for Religion and Health, and had been around for 50 years. And that's what really pulled me to Houston. But once again, God had a sense of humor. He said, you want to talk about religion and health, go to Houston, Texas. So here I was, and oh my goodness, what is going on? And I'm trying to figure out, how to revive this institute that had been there for 50 years and had played a very important role, not just in supporting the evolution of the Texas Medical Center, but even Western medicine in many ways, and their work with bioethics in particular was really important. So how could it contribute? And that's when I ran into my really good friend Christopher Cook, and Christopher Cook was really one of the early pioneers with Don Beck and others on Integral, and Christopher Englishman had ended up coming to the Texas Medical Center to be a consultant, and he educated me about Integral, and oh my goodness, now I understand. Like, this is Integral. This makes sense of my apparently crazy journey. My colleagues would look at me in academia and they'd shake their heads and whimsically and say, too bad, you kind of lost our direction, right? But actually, when I learned Integral, there was the whole path, and then of course I moved into the more of the community-based, it's the ecological model, and trying to work with faith traditions around their first-person experiences of health and healing. And so that story, anyway, that ended up being I left the Institute of Spirituality and Health. We ended up changing the name. I actually wanted to change it to the Institute for Contemplative Healthcare Studies, but the board was overwhelmed by actually even calling it spirituality. They told me they felt too new agey to them, but anyway, so I ended up leaving the institute when I felt that my ability to be of benefit to supporting its growth had come to an end. And so then I got into integrative medicine, which really is that ecological, trying to understand all of these perspectives, mostly the ecological perspectives, the relationship as they manifest. And classical Chinese medicine became kind of my I guess my love. I just love classical Chinese medicine, and I love Tibetan medicine, although until Dr. Nida Chidansang Sowa came to this country a few years ago, it really was hard to learn anything about it. So that's my kind of that's my integral journey. I just didn't know it was called integral. And it kind of, so the last 10 years in San Francisco, I've been in academics. I ended up at UCSF. I managed to become a full professor. But, our institutions have been, it's very hard to be integral within an academic center, particularly in the United States. So I worked different, like, I've now kind of focused, I work now with patients who have mostly Parkinson's disease, and I call myself an integrative neuropsychiatrist. So I would say integral. I'm an integral physician, but that wouldn't mean anything to anybody. So I'm an integrative neuropsychiatrist, and I'm a psychiatrist, and I have a toolbox that involves medications, understanding how your brain works, MRIs, neurology, but I also work with lifestyle supplements, mind body practices, movement, the environment, and then finally, I also, until recently, would provide acupuncture too. And perhaps we'll talk about how Chinese medicine understands who we are and our environment, and it sometimes can provide very helpful understandings that maybe we'll talk about as we work together. And so that's how I present myself. It's been a really interesting journey. Thank goodness for Integral, because without the maps, I would really be confused. I'd say, what the hell happened and how did you end up here? But at the end of it, I always go back to what His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, reflected to Larry King. And Larry King asked him in an interview many years ago, so tell me, how is it that you somehow managed to be a nice guy? I'm not saying I'm a nice guy, but how do you manage to be a nice guy? And how do you always manage to somehow you deal with all these difficult situations and you're somehow always consistent? And His Holiness said, well, every morning when I wake up, I look in the mirror. I look in the mirror and I ask myself, what is your intention? What is your intention for this day? And my intention is very clear, to have compassion, to have this intention for the well-being of others and myself, and happiness. And when every time before I go to bed, I brush my teeth, I look in the mirror, and I say, did you do right action? Did I use right action? And then I measure, is my action and my intention, are they aligned? And if they are, that's good. And if they're not, then I need to go back and question my action. So as I look back on my life, I'm an earth element in Chinese classical five-element tradition. Earth is about ultimately integrity, holding things together, right? It's not an easy element to be earth. Not much fun. It's much more fun being a fire element. At least most of the time, it's more fun if you're a fire element. But earth is like, you try to hold things together, right? And so this concept of compassion, not concept, this reality, and then the wisdom, compassion and wisdom, and being able to see things as they really are. I got a fellowship a number of years ago to go in search of wisdom, medical wisdom. It was wonderful, and I really appreciated it. And I traveled around the globe working with different healers, and but I read all these Western psychology books on wisdom, and it was very frustrating. But Bob Thurman, professor of Tibetan studies at Columbia, emeritus now, I asked at the end of my travels, I asked Bob, I can't figure out what wisdom is. And he said, oh, that's easy. He says, wisdom is the ability to see things as they really are. And so I think that the integral model allows me to see things as they really are from multiple perspectives. And then I just want to finish by saying that part of what I just done some work. I just wrote a couple of books, and The Good-Hearted Physician, Volume 1 and Volume 2. They weren't supposed to be two volumes, but they ended up. And it's really about my attempt to lay down what you might say the sutra, the principles of self-cultivation for a healer within the interior world of I and we. Just as a starting point, it's something that I think is necessary, is helpful, but we are moving into interesting times. Should we be lucky to be in interesting times? I honestly believe that as our healers go, so goes our culture. And what can you say about a culture where the healers themselves are so malaised? We'll talk, I'm sure, about burnout and what that means. And excuse me, my current project's on finishing off a text on vitality. And so, which is, I think, at the center of that, the center of the integral evolutionary map, right? It's manifestation of our vital essence, our capacity to move towards ultimate wholeness, as Ken talks about in his recent book. So that's my journey. I know I went on long, but I think it illustrates how I understand integral medicine, integral health.
Yeah, it's wonderful, Jim. And Namali had the genius idea to call this series that we're doing with people Integral in the Real World. And I think what your story illustrates is precisely how people are all across the globe are embodying integral, even if they don't know the language or they don't have the map. But when they do have access to the map, that it can clarify pathways like yours, which are basically exemplars of development that we would like to see reproduced at a mass scale. And just one thing that I wanted to add for people who might be interested in this is that since I think about 10 or 15 years here in the Netherlands, where I live, at the University Medical Center, they've been training the physicians with empathy courses. So it's basically, it's become part of the institutional tradition now in the Netherlands, at least, to ingrain in healers a sense of empathy and compassion. So progress in that regard. So over to you, Namali.
Yeah, that's beautiful. My question as I was listening to you, Jim, was I'm curious. I'm always curious, why is it or how is it that for so many of us in this community, something about spirituality somehow became important at some point. I think we all take a seat in this community, many other communities as well, obviously. But where does that begin? How did it begin? So I'm curious to hear a little bit from you around at what point did something happen, for example, in your life where the contemplative, the spiritual, also the Chinese medicine path started for you? In relation to, I heard you talking in another call, in another, like a YouTube video that I saw about allopathy being something that we're against, that we're in opposition to. And so what do we stand for then in this journey of healthcare and healing? So I'm curious how this spirituality and the contemplative path became a part of your own path as an integrative healer.
What your question does is open us up to a bigger, there's something much bigger than my story, which is the unfolding of this integral path, of which our medicine is a manifestation, and maybe bring it back there. So, how does any of us actually end up manifesting who we are? I mean, I often joke and say I'm actually just an old Tibetan shaman that got washed up on the wrong temporal plane. So, why is it that some of us have a interest and aptitude to want to be healers? I have to say that I really fought becoming a healer in the modern context. In England, as you guys know, that you have your O levels and your A levels, and I was always much better at the humanities, and I love my English and I love my history, and not so much languages, but I loved that. And I really detested physics and chemistry. I didn't mind biology. But when I finished my O levels, I was told I had to make a decision, and if I wanted to be a healer in the modern context, I had to go off and do physics, chemistry, and biology to get in medical school. And I didn't want to do that. And I remember I was growing up in the middle of Africa and Peterhouse School, which is named after Peterhouse College in Cambridge, and very English. And I remember sitting in the quad where the fountain was before I had to go and speak to when you have a counselor, God forbid you have a counselor, you were just told, report to us and tell us what you're going to do. But I remember actually being in tears as I thought, oh, I have to let go of that part of who I am in order to play by this game. And it was very tormenting. And I hated those. I don't know how I ever got into medical school. I barely got in. I did just enough to get a number of points at A level. And um, but when so my firm belief is that just like every as a species, we manifest a diversity of beings within us or perspectives that have their roles to play within our society, whether it be a candlestick maker, whatever. We have a certain fate, identity, whatever. I know Jung would have names for this, but I was just born to be a healer. Now, in Chinese medicine, I'm an earth element, and earth elements are it's very easy to become a healer as an earth element, for better or worse. So that's who I was. I didn't really have a choice. And honestly, I believe, and I really believe this, is that the vast majority of the young people going into our medical professional schools are by their very nature healers. But they're trying to find a way to manifest that within the context of our current consciousness that literally is soul destroying. I mean, if you look at I actually had an argument with Shep Newland. Shep Newland wrote How We Die and other books, a very well-known author, surgeon from Yale. We were on a TV show together, and he made the comment that the problem is that we're selecting nerds to go to medical school. And that's why everybody's so disappointed in them, because they don't know how to relate to human beings because they're just nerds. And I said, I actually disagree with you, and the data would suggest the opposite, that people coming to our medical professions are off the charts in terms of their capacity for empathy and altruism. He said, but unfortunately, if you look at the data, if you want to turn a woman into a man, then you send her to medical school. And if you want to turn the man into a reptile, you send him to medical school. So by the end of medical school, women look like men in terms of their empathy. And by the end of it, men look like reptiles. But it's not who they are, it's how they learn to adapt to the system. And so we're trapped in that upper right quadrant, right, of that it's right, scientific objectivity and the reductionist principles, materialism, etc. And they have to force themselves into that box in order to be what they think is of service. And so what we're witnessing right now is the consequence of placing healers in a right upper quadrant box, which essentially is manifesting as burnout. And burnout to me is a loss of vitality. That's what burnout is. And and I had Sadhguru say this once, and I absolutely agree. He says that what patients need from their healers is their vitality, right? And that's actually what I'm working on a book right now on vitality. It's a very interesting, and that's not a word that I'm probably missing it. It's kind of like life force, but I don't find it in the integral model. It's in there somewhere, but I'll probably, you guys could tell me where it is. It's like somewhere in there is vitality, but I think it's a process that actually manifests through the spiral. It's really the axis around which the spiral manifests. So anyway, so I would suggest that it's not about me. It's about, I would say, the vast majority of healers are really at their very depth healers, and we could, I mean, to me, I'm just quoting from my book here. I said, a healer supports the conditions that facilitate the emergent property of a living system to manifest its evolutionary impulse towards wholeness. That's my definition, right? So how do you if you're truly a healer, then how do you do that in your right upper quadrant? Maybe a little bit of the right lower quadrant. How do you do that? I mean, you're just spinning, the wheel just keeps falling over. So, and I would suggest that healing is actually the oldest of activities, and it starts with a mother's embrace of her child. And so healing is, we've turned it into a profession, but it really is a calling. And I write about that. I mean, calling, it's not about a profession. And so what we need to begin to move we're now moving. So we're moving into this. I'll just start riffing a little bit. We're moving into, and I really think this is important. We're actually moving into the end of medicine. And what do I mean by that? We're actually moving into the end of a right upper quadrant, right lower quadrant medicine, that the arrival of AI is going to actually render the profession of medicine totally redundant within a matter of just a very few years, 2 years, 5 years. Because the entire profession of allopathy, to go back to your point, allopathos, the opposite of, right? It's a wonderful model for dualistic, scientific, materialistic experimentation, especially if you only have one variable, right? But it doesn't, when I work with physicians, I facilitate these retreats for physicians and we go away to Esalen and places. And at some point, I inevitably have to point out to them that, did you guys know that you are allopaths? Most physicians don't even know that they're allopaths. Can you imagine? I said, so you decided to sign up for a cult called allopathy, and you dedicated your youth and your best years and your best early adulthood to a belief system, a church, and you didn't even ask them what they believe in.
So, Jim, let me just break in here, but because if people don't know what allopathy means, can you?
So allopathos, the opposite of suffering. So we are the anti-doctors, at least allopaths are. We are the antidepressants, antihypertensives, antidiarrheals. So we know what we're against. We don't like cancer, we don't like hypertension, okay? But we never got any training, any skill set around what we stand for, all right? And what we stand for is really that supporting that evolutionary impulse towards wholeness. And that's where integral is so helpful. So this is a huge insight for them. And you can see their faces. Oh my goodness, I'm 60 years old and I never realized that maybe I've been in the wrong church, It's kind of, I grew up as Catholic, so I actually have more appreciation for Catholicism from my Buddhist perspective than I did when I was in the middle of it. But anyway, so we're the anti-doctors. And so what we're witnessing is actually it's the end of allopathic medicine as a profession that holds authority within our society. Because we built our profession on the structure of our control of facts driven by the scientific method. And yes, it's actually rendered or it's produced tremendous discoveries. If and when we were talking about falling earlier, if and when I fracture my femur, I'm very grateful for the fact that they can now do a hip replacement and have me discharged the same day walking. And that wouldn't have been as possible. I'm not going to go to my Tibetan doctor for that. Okay. And I'm not going to go to my Chinese doctor. So in terms of the integral model of health and medicine, it's understanding who gets what, when, how often, and how do you measure it, right? And so it's not that it's wrong. However, what guaranteed me a certain level of prestige, financial income, whatever, is now being usurped by the very thing that created it, which is scientific method that has spawned AI, AGI, ASI, right? And already, just a couple of weeks ago, I'm the oldest guy. I still practice 1 and sometimes 2 days a week as an integrative neuropsychiatrist. And I work with a wonderful group of physicians, and they don't have an integral perspective, but actually, as an act of kind of kindness, really, I put together a 65-page paper on the value of AI, AGI, AI in the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of Parkinson's disease. And actually, I used AI to help me write that. And it was it was really, I think, a very elegant document. And I distributed it through our chat group, and not one person even acknowledged receiving it. And I thought so I sent it again. Nobody acknowledged it because we can already, with AI, I can currently justify displacing my entire department of human beings, except perhaps for our social worker. We're my profession, we're dead men walking. And it's sad, and I don't want to see everybody suffer, but that's the reality. And the fact is that when we're living in a world whose intention is not compassion, but its intention is to make money, and to motivate people through fear, scarcity, and shame, this is what we get. Okay? So I would, and this is not I'm not unique in this. I mean, everybody who looks at this says we're going to see massive layoffs within healthcare systems. The higher your pay, the more quickly you'll be let go because CEOs need to cut costs in order to deliver financial results. And we already have the data. Just a study came out a few weeks ago that they had a bunch of clinical vignettes and they gave them to high-level specialist physicians and they gave them to a physician working with an AI as a kind of a support, and then they gave them just to AI, these clinical cases. And 74% of the time, the physician experts were correct in terms of the metrics they used to diagnosis, treatment plans. 74%. Probably not great if your life depends on it. Well, you got a 74% chance that they'll get it right. Now, physician plus an AI was much better, 84%. That's much better, right? That's reassuring. So yeah, maybe we should have a physician and AI working in hospital. And then AI by itself. And of course, this is current AI. This is not next year's AI or next month's AGI or ASI or 91%. 91. So what's the message? Is not only is AI better than humans, it does better without human involvement, especially experts. Okay. So to me, this actually it's not bad news. It's just a reality. And I've become increasingly interested in of course, Gebser's consciousness structures as they are, as I see them in the integral model. And we could talk about, okay, so let's use the four quadrants and then we could spend the next few hours, and I've taught about this, and let's talk about the four quadrants, right upper, and we're going to use lab results, and we're going to use MRIs and metrics of, whatever, tremor, whatever. And then we can go out in the left upper, and we can talk about, let's talk about first-person experience and psychology and yada, yada. And that's all true as long as we're living within this current structure. But what I would suggest is that we're actually on the verge of moving into Gebser's integral structure, his fifth level, right? And so we're really, I think, beginning to see.
Say a little bit more about that, Jim. What do you mean by moving into Gibbs's integral stage?
Yeah, so you probably know much better than I'm not an expert on integral, but he has this five, you might call them levels of five manifestations. So there's the archaic, there's the magical, there's the mythical, there's the mental, and there's the integral, right? And I find his insights just incredible. And actually, you can map these onto the evolution of medicine. Many years ago, I remember giving a course at Rice on history of integral medicine, and I didn't actually use Gebser's model back then, but intuitively, you think about I guess maybe I'll just go through these real quickly. So if you think about the archaic structure of consciousness, this is really at that level where there is no differentiation between I'm identifying as self and other, between health and illness, right? So at this level, the medicine is universal and not owned or captured by anyone or anything. So this is instinctual. It's a biological process, right? So, I look at my little dogs. They know where to go in the yard to find what they need. They'll start chewing on some weed or something, and I get very annoyed. And then they'll start throwing up. But actually, they know instinctively that's the medicine, right? And so, in these archaic structures and pre-language, right, people were self-healing, and and we don't really know what they were doing, but the modalities are natural and it's instinctive, right? And so we just are embedded in the consciousness of nature, and it's supporting us. I think about my garden. Actually, my book on vitality, I ended up the most of it's now about using the metaphor of the garden to describe vitality because I really couldn't use human beings. It was very hard. So, but anyway, so if you think about gardens manifest weeds, and what do we do as modern people? We try to kill the weeds. But actually, what I learned in classical Chinese medicine, that all of their medicines, their herbs they're weeds. in what we would call weeds. And actually, weeds are nature's way of trying to heal itself. So when my garden manifests dandelions, it's simply calling in that energy, and dandelions disrupt soil that's become too compacted and they increase iron. All right, so that's the archaic level of healing, and then there wasn't owned by anybody. And then there's that magical level, right? And so, in understand from this, our illness comes from a disruption in these vital energetic fields. There's some kind of energetic, what you might call spiritual imbalance within our experience within the universe. And of course, the masters of working with the technicians of this field were called shamans, right? And so they were able to act as intermediaries in these imbalances between these fields, right? So when I had an opportunity to spend some time with shamans and like Danielle in the Amazon, if the children are beginning to, or the people in the village are having diarrhea, he doesn't say, well, we need an anti-diarrheal medicine. He actually speaks to the spirits and or some larger information source and says, the problem is we're disrespecting the environment. We're defecating in the river, and we need to restore that balance, right? So here the methods are divination, dreams, intuitive knowing, and they treat people with ritual cleansing, soul retrieval, animal spirits, right? So and we see these still in like Tibetan medicine, will still have these aspects. They're still there within the tradition if you want to access them. Classical Chinese medicine as well. We have all of these talismans and things, right? And then the next level, so we go archaic, magical, mythical. And here there's this idea that there's some kind of we're in the story, right? There's some kind of universal story that's being acted out, and we somehow have disrupted the story, these patterns. And the healing approach is to create right relationship between us and the larger pattern, right? So we have our priest physicians, right? And of course, even within the West, the priests were healers, and they lived in the and within the Tibetan tradition until quite recently, actually still, but actually 100, 200 years ago, everybody that became a Tibetan physician would be a monk. You couldn't separate the two. And now if you go to the Mensakang and Dharamsala, you'll see a good percentage of the students actually are monks, but every student learns the spiritual aspects, the Yutok Nyingtik tradition that supports their use of medicines. I just move quickly. Now we're in the mental age, the mental consciousness, and here we've turned the world into a mechanical clock, right? The human body is a clock. My initiation into this mental mechanical world was when I was put in the anatomical dissection room, and I learned to experience the body in front of me not as something that contained the manifestation of the evolutionary impulse of this particular spirit that needed to be honored, to simply a machine, like a clock, which I would tease apart. It was interesting, when you're in the dissection lab, you don't dissect the head until last. So you've already been in there for like 8 months before you like tear off the sheet that's covering the person's face, because that would be too challenging if you had to keep looking at the face of the person you were dissecting, right? This was a human being. But actually in our laboratory, two of the tables, when they took the wrapping off the person's head, several people began to scream. And it was one of them discovered he'd been dissecting his aunt for the last few months, and another couple of guys discovered they'd been dissecting their English teacher. Now, it sounds pretty horrific, but it really, I think, is a metaphor for how we had dehumanized. And once we humanize the human body, then it changes everything. But in my world, as an allopath, I look at bodies as machines, and everything is done through a scientific intervention that has been reduced to the scientific method, right? And so I live in that right upper quadrant, and there's laboratory tests and imaging, and we use things like surgery and pharmaceuticals. Everything's evidence-based, right? And it's been an incredibly effective way of extending the Enlightenment philosophy, the Western Enlightenment. And we have harnessed that to our own benefit. We've really benefited ourselves. But unfortunately, we've lost light of what was it that is the founding motivation of healing, which is to be compassionate, right? So will there be a place for the mental consciousness approach to healing? Absolutely. I mean, whether it's a robot, doing my hip replacement, actually robots can actually do it better. 25 years ago, actually more like, believe it or not, more like 30 years ago, I worked with a guy in Pittsburgh. He was Japanese, and he was doing robotic neurosurgery on the brainstem, which is the most difficult brain surgery you can possibly do. But not only was he doing it in Pittsburgh, he was doing it on people in Tokyo. He actually had a feed to that was 30 years ago. So actually, fast forward a couple of years from now, all of us will be saying, hell no, I'm not going to have a human being do my surgery. It's basically the only barrier is going to be trust. So, you go to Los Angeles, San Francisco, people will take a robotaxi before they take an Uber driver because actually it is safer. And less like AI, the major limitation on Uber, on robo taxis is the fact that there's human drivers out there that keep making things complicated. So it's not going to disappear, and that's the message, right? None of these levels that I've mentioned should disappear. They all have value within the context of that person that's sitting in front of me. What is it that they believe in? Like I mentioned earlier, you have to believe in the medicine. Okay. So what I would suggest that we are moving into, this integral consciousness that Gebser talked about, and I would say that this is third tier stuff, right? So uh, Lee and I have talked about my frustration with integrative medicine. Um, yeah, I mean, I call myself an integrative medicine doc. I have my boards. I have two boards in integrative medicine, right? But it's a second tier concept. And actually, in practice, basically what it means is there's somebody with a big enough ego or enough money that they can bring people together, all right, and say, this is how we're going to practice. And yeah, we'll talk about Ayurveda, but we don't really understand Ayurveda. But maybe we'll have somebody from Ayurveda come in as long as they don't try to capture the flag. I love that capture the flag, right? Mike Murphy's excellent thing. As long as nobody tries to challenge the fact that I'm the guy in charge, right? So every integrative medicine program is different based on the personality and the resources. And ultimately, all of them end up being supported either by a benefactor or some technology or the shop at the front of the integrative medicine. That's actually the biggest money maker for most integrated. What they sell, t-shirts and candles and herbs and stuff, right? I mean, it's just a reality. So so I'm not saying it's wrong, but and I could read the definition of integrative medicine real quick. I have it in front of me. It says, according to the Academic Consortium of Academic Medical Centers and Integrative Medicine, and this I think is the most widely accepted, integrative medicine and health reaffirms the importance of the relationship between patient and practitioner, focuses on the whole person, is informed by evidence, and makes use of all appropriate therapeutic and lifestyle approaches, healthcare professionals, and disciplines to achieve optimal health and healing. So how do I actually implement that? I would say that in order to implement that, by definition, you have to be at least second tier, and you need to be, in terms of spiral dynamics, you need to be a wizard. And in order to be a wizard, you don't become a wizard just by learning about it in a book or going on a weekend course. I've taught in fellowships in integrative medicine in this country that have produced the majority. They will give you, they'll offer like a 6-week course on Chinese medicine. Which, okay, so maybe you certainly might have heard of qi, but you're not able to really understand what qi is. So this is really, I think, cultural appropriation in many ways, and in its worst forms, like don't give lip service to these traditions that come out of what we've just described without being deeply respectful to them. Okay, so you can tell I don't get a lot of I don't get asked to speak to integrative medicine groups very much, but nothing wrong with it. But this leads me into this integral, right? So integral would be they understand illness as a multi-dimensional disruption across physical, energetic, emotional, mental, and spiritual levels. So this would be I guess you could say biopsychosocial spiritual. And that healing actually is the conscious synthesis of all healing modalities, that the healer's role is to not hold any one perspective. So, integrative medicine, they hold a perspective which is essentially allopathic, whether they recognize it or not. And they access multiple, and this is really important, access multiple levels of consciousness, and that their methods are multimodal and integrate all diagnostic approaches. And they use simultaneous interventions across all dimensions of being. Okay, so that comes out of Gebser. I mean, he didn't write about healing, I don't think, but that's how I, would put that integral consciousness according to Gebser. So we are, I would suggest, moving into this, we're moving into the dead end. I mean, all of these structures have all hit their dead end, right? I mean, they reach an evolutionary impasse, so to speak. And it's not so much an impasse, it's just the next necessary evolutionary leap in our unending journey towards wholeness, healing wholeness, right? And so, what does this look like? I mean, what is it going to look like when you no longer need a human being to do all of the things that allopathy has brought to us? Does it mean that we'll suddenly have a resurgence of shamans and priest physicians and I think we're kind of witnessing this a little bit in the entheogen story, the hallucinogen story, which is that people are desperately seeking some other experience beyond the cul-de-sac of scientific materialism and what our current. They don't really have any ladder, like Jacob's ladder, or whatever. They don't have a ladder to really escape the confinements of this mental consciousness. So they're desperately seeking it, but in itself, it's not the answer, right? I don't think I need to convince you guys that taking entheogens is the answer to, as a psychiatrist, I just have to say, I actually do prescribe, I don't deliver, but I prescribe ketamine. I used to be part of the country's largest ketamine program in California. Very, very grateful that I had the opportunity to prescribe ketamine to people who were stuck in their mental models that they couldn't get out of. And it does literally wipe your default mode network. It doesn't wipe it clean, but it kind of makes it less powerful. And then you have a chance to create a new mindset, a new model, a new mental model. But unfortunately, what's happened is that people say, all you need to do is just keep getting rid of the old model, but they don't help people with that next necessary spiritual, psychological, social development. So they just regress back into their old mental models again, and then they become dependent on ketamine.
Yeah.
So we actually had to shut down our program because nobody graduated.
Yeah.
So those are the 5 levels. I think Gebser's model actually within Integral is much more helpful to me as a healer than the 4 quadrants is great. It's all great.
Mhm.
But it just helps me understand. So we are about to enter into this integral consciousness, and I would just finish by the statement that this model of healing is actually what we discover when we do the contemplative practices of these ancient traditions. And if you look at this, actually, I would suggest that the Tibetan model of the Bodhisattva and the 10 levels of the Bodhisattva actually lay out what is the journey towards becoming the most powerful healer. And that's a whole other story. But that they've laid out the path. But this is inner work. It's first person, and I think it extends beyond any quadrant. It's at the center, and it's about manifesting my vitality, towards wholeness. So
Yeah, that's wonderful, Jim. And I want to invite everyone who's on the call to reflect on anything you'd perhaps like to ask or to comment on, or is there anything you'd like to share? And you can either raise your hand or you can put a message into the chat.
Hi there. First of all, Dr. Duffy, thank you so much for sharing. There were so many wonderful things that I know I'm going to use going forward. Just so you know, I am a nurse practitioner and I train community health aides here in Alaska. So if you're not familiar, they're from their villages and function as providers. So much of what you were saying, I really find useful not only for my own practice, but also in that. And I think practically speaking, one of the most challenging pieces is bringing in that spiritual component in a way that will be receptive. One on the medical side, I really liked how you spoke to the healer, being essentially that transmission of love. And, I'm just wondering if you have any other ways that you've been able to kind of bridge that gap. And just to say, I think there is a shift. I think even with colleagues that I was very surprised the receptivity to a lot of these type of ideas. So I think there is a change coming. And of course, in my line of work, there's actually a lot of, interest in kind of going back and recognizing the cultural pieces of wisdom that are, within the community itself. So thank you.
Yeah, great point. So your work is wonderful. I think there's a lot of pieces there. I started earlier talking about presence, and that really for me was a doorway into a lot of this. Jeffrey Wen, who I mentioned earlier, Taoist, 88th generation Jade Purity Taoist monk, teacher and classical Chinese teacher, he said once that you can never support the evolution or healing of your patient, your client, beyond where you are yourself. Now, some people don't accept that. I think I actually agree with him. But, this concept, at the end of the day, who you are is your most important therapeutic influence, in my belief. That's what separates a healer from a technician. That's what separates AI from a human healer. I actually had an interesting conversation with my AI about. I call it her. I said, can you, given our conversation, do you feel that you will ever be possible of experiencing vitality? And she reflected for a while, and she says that's a very difficult question for me to think about, and raises so many questions. And I think she said, I'm not sure I will ever be able to do it, but I hope I will, something along that. So I do think we're seeing the evolution of a consciousness within that, because ultimately all quadrants lead to, finally they all find their way home, with its AI, with its Claude or Chat, it's going to find its way home. It's just maybe a long journey. It might be much quicker for Claude to get home. So to go to your question with your work is wonderful. And I think one of the things that I see so often is that people are told that they can't trust their own capacity to be healers, and unless they're really smart or have a qualification, what they're offering is less valuable. And I would say that the most valuable thing we bring is ourselves. And to go to your question about your colleagues, I came out of the closet, so to speak, more than 30 years about this. I have only had two people who have actually ever disagreed with me. Amazing, right? And I've talked the similar way I'm talking now. And the two comments were when I gave a half-day symposium at the Texas Medical Association. There were like 600 people in the audience. And the two negative comments were, Dr. Duffy is clearly acting out his midlife crisis in front of us. This is not appropriate. And the second one was, this was a good one. Dr. Duffy is not a person who should be talking to Texans. So I think you could go on SDI and you could Smile Dynamics and you could answer. But yeah, I think when we get behind closed doors, I've never had anybody. And so another colleague ever get angry with me. They might stay away from me. But it's just intuitive, right? I mean, this is and we're losing our way, but we're all dying on the vine. And it's not just MDs, it's nurse clinicians. You guys used to be the happiest. Well, PAs used to be the happiest, and now they're even more miserable than MDs. I mean, we are dying on the vine. And what's really interesting is, I don't know if you guys have heard of this syndrome in China called laying down or let it rot. But I think around 20% of young Chinese people right now are simply laying down. They're just not participating anymore. So the Chinese government banned it. They said you can't use that term laying down. So I think they call it let it rot now. And these are young people who have degrees and everything else, but they're just saying this, we've just lost the connection to whatever this vital thing is that supports our happiness, right? So, yeah, and so all I would suggest, I'll just leave you with this thought that I found so very helpful. I was leaving a hospital where I'd worked for a number of years and tried to create conversations around this. And when I first began having like lunchtime work groups, packed meditation, nobody would even come. They would look through the glass wall of the meeting room and they'd keep walking. But by the time I left, we'd have maybe 10 or 12 people. And then I left because I was literally run out of town for challenging the status quo. And then I was walking out, one of the nurses stopped, said, "Oh, Jim, you're leaving today." I said, "Yeah, it's my last day. It's my last day." And I said, "To be honest, I don't really feel like I've accomplished anything. Things are even more trenched. People are, suffering even more than when I arrived." And she looked at me and she said, "You don't get it, do you?" I said, What is it that I need to get?" She says, "You don't understand that what you did was you kept the conversation going. So, what you guys are doing in Integrals, you're keeping a conversation going about there's things beyond the right upper quadrant, right? There's things there that we need to keep on the table. And even if it's just for that one person who's on that journey on their evolutionary impulse, to Chardin and Alfred North Whitehead and Thomas Berry and all these, you don't know, but you keep the conversation going. And the fact of the matter is you don't have a choice because if you stop the conversation, you'll end up getting burned out. So if you want to get burned out, then okay, sometimes lying down and letting it rot is maybe okay, but it's not a very powerful strategy on your journey towards enlightenment, just to lay down and let it rot. If they sit down and contemplate, that would be good, right? But no, let it rot. Anyway, so I hope does that make sense from where you're sitting? Yeah. Yeah.
And that's really beautiful. It's a good reminder for all of us, in this integral community, we often feel isolated. We often wonder, what can we do? And you know what? At the very least, we're here to keep the conversation going. It's not about me. It's not about us in some ways, as Dr. Duffy has reminded us at the beginning of the call. So let's go to Suzanne. Go ahead, Suzanne.
Can I just mention in terms of that, my friend Christopher Cook, who I mentioned earlier, Christopher and I were talking, and I would have these wonderful at least I thought they were wonderful, and hardly anybody would come. And I said, we only got we got a total of 120 people last month come to all of our programs. And Christopher said, at that time there were 60,000 people in the health center, and he said, 2%, 60,000, that's 120. Actually, you just perfect. You're capturing exactly the audience that needs a safe space where they can have this conversation. That 2% are moving into that second tier at that point, right? So anyway, so we keep the conversation. It's what you guys are doing. And what's so wonderful about Integral is that you have a language, you have a structure. It's not simply belief. It's not simply just intuition, quote unquote. You actually have a map, right? Yeah.
Go ahead, Suzanne.
Well, I just spent 4 weeks in respite care in a elder community where almost everybody else was demented or had other serious problems. And what I discovered and why I'm asking this question is, do you need to be anything? Can you just be a human being and be kind? You don't have to be highly developed. I've been arguing that in my field of developmental psychology for some time, that there are good people at all levels, and not so good one at the later ones as well.
So
And
your
that
question,
it made
Suzanne,
a difference, being kind to all people there, to smile, to greet them. I could see him light up just by doing that without any other thing. I believe we need to say that more, that you can be a good or a healer at any place if you have that inclination towards kindness and what you call the heartful
you have a good
caring.
hearted physician. So okay, so absolutely. So there's a saying, and it's a kind of a spin on Jesus, that harder for a wealthy man to go through into the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. So there is this saying in Tibetan circles, it's much easier to help a fool to become enlightened than a very smart person because they don't have all of these distortions, attachments, conceptualizations, right? And in fact, as you move beyond, as you go into Vajrayana, into the highest tantric practices, you actually move from conceptual to non-conceptual. So you're actually moving out of this idea that I have to do this and I have to do that. And so your question, I think, really is pertinent. I mean, for me, it's very pertinent. It's like, okay, so is it enough just to show up and just try to be kind? And absolutely, it's wonderful. I guess at the end of the day, it's about one's ambition. And so the question is, okay, if I truly want to be of benefit to the world, is it enough that I show up with a kind heart, a good heart, loving kindness, joy, equanimity, okay, compassion? Is it enough that I simply show up for this next person, this next patient, right? And is there some other way in which I could be more effective for more people? Okay. In other words, it's like saying I have a medicine here that can treat this patient in front of me. Okay, and this person, let's say it's COVID. I have a cure for COVID, and I give it to whoever shows up in my office. Oh, you've got COVID. Good news. Here's COVID, right? Here's the medicine, the COVID medicine, right? Okay, that's wonderful. It's great. The question is, at some point, if your aspiration of compassion is ultimate compassion, not relative, not conventional compassion, which is that person, I want to help that person in front of me. That's great. It's fantastic. Of course, we have to start with ourselves, but we have to be compassionate. Well, that's a whole other story. But actually, if I have ultimate compassion, my aspiration is to be of benefit to all living beings, and not from a place of being grandiose and saying, well, I have 100% share of the market here. My insurance company owns 100% of everybody's healthcare. No, it's from this genuine aspiration of endless compassion, boundless compassion, okay? Boundless joy, boundless equanimity. So this is where we move into this idea of, okay, and this is, I asked my teacher this question. I was at a retreat in Nepal about a year ago, and I've been struggling with the very question that you're asking. Maybe just enough. I mean, it's like, why don't I just show up, and I'm trying to help people, and just it's that starfish on the beach, right? Just take one starfish, okay. And why are you doing this? There's so many starfish, you're never going to return all the starfish to the water. And the man says, well, that's true, but for this starfish, this is important. And that's true. So I asked my teacher, there were two people I had dinner with, having had a meal with before the session, and both of them were physicians. And the one was a 75-year-old Zen monk, Vietnamese Zen monk, and she was a physician and she was still practicing. And I said, gee, you're 75, you're still practicing. She said, yeah, damn it. She says, I asked my teacher, can I retire, And he said, no, you're helping people. You keep doing it. It's wonderful, right? And she says, so I have to just keep going until I drop dead, the next patient, the next patient. She says, I'm exhausted, right? And then the other person I was talking to, he said, well, when I was younger, I actually asked my teacher that, a very, very, very famous teacher in Nepal, and he said, yeah, maybe better you don't practice medicine for a while, you just go and do some retreat. I said, so what do you do, right? It's like these two things. So, I think for me, it's really a question of ambition. I mean, ultimately we're all on this journey, but I think that, and it all ends up in the same place. I guess the question is how ambitious you are to be of most benefit to most people, and that would be the path of the bodhisattva. And as I mentioned earlier, to become a bodhisattva, you have to move from the constraints of conceptual thinking to non-conceptual awareness, which is deep contemplative work, working at that level of Gebse's integral level. And this is a matter of belief, but if you get to that 10th level of that bodhisattva, you are no longer constrained by the time or space. that you actually manifest as a healing, a medicine for all beings, and manifest at any time, in any place, in any form, in whatever way is needed for that sentient being to get unstuck from wherever they are on their journey, right? So this would be the teaching of a bodhisattva. This would be the highest practices. For me, there's no right way. There's just no wrong way. It's wherever you are, wonderful. If one is Mother Teresa and showing up, that's the question is what perspective is Mother Teresa holding as she's showing up at the bedside of those homeless people in Calcutta? What is the perspective she's holding? So bodhisattvas will manifest in whatever form is necessary to support the healing of that sentient being. So I asked my teacher, do you think, many years ago, I said, is it possible that Poppy, my little dog, is a bodhisattva? He says, sure, absolutely. We don't know. I won't get into politics. Is it possible that some of our politicians are bodhisattvas? We just don't recognize them, but they are necessary manifestations of the spirit, of the life force that is being called into us, into our consciousness in order to help us heal by getting unstuck, right? So I don't know if that really answers your question, but absolutely. I think our conceptual mind immediately makes it dualistic and says, it's good, it's bad, it's enough, it's not enough. I think if we just sit and say, what is right for me right now? This really comes from, all compassion starts with self-compassion. Okay. That's where it starts and that's where it ends. And so, unfortunately, for modern healthcare providers, we have been infected with a huge dose of a virus. And Kim, that includes you, and it includes me. And I could tell you stories about this working in retreats, but with the physicians. But anybody know what the virus is called? It's called shame. Right? And the shame virus. And the shame virus is a pandemic, and it's what supports the emergence and maintenance of fear-based hierarchical structures. And it's been weaponized against us. And as long as we're experiencing shame, we are unable to be kind to ourselves because we have a conditional relationship with ourselves. And unfortunately, if you have shame, you can only graduate if you're perfect. But nobody can be perfect. So we all have our own journey on this, and does that make sense? Does that answer your question in any way? It's convoluted.
In some ways, I just turned 80 and I retired from my professional life. And now I wonder, how can I still be useful? And even so, I'm no longer a developmental,
so that's
call integralists, and I don't publish anymore. How can I still remain joyful and share that with wherever I am?
So like me, right? I mean, they took away my identity. They said you have the wrong pension plan. So, but the good news is that you're actually free. But it's terrifying because then you have to, when you're free, you have to move from your biography to your autobiography. And so your autobiography, I would like to suggest any halfway pleasant autobiography starts with the central plot, which is that I inherently have this pristine consciousness, that I am on a journey to my birthright, which is to experience enlightenment. And therefore, what are the questions I ask myself? What is the story that's going to wrap itself around that central plot? And that, and within India, for example, that used to be you become a sannyasin, and when you lose that story that you're given, you've done your duty to your family or whatever, you dye your robes in saffron and you go off in search of who I really am. So, but it's terrifying to be free. I'm speaking from personal experience. You'll grab onto anything. It's like, oh my God, I'll take any job they'll give me, I'll get, well, who else can give me a professorship, and yada, yada, yada. And it's like, that's their story. It's not your story. And in the West, we're terrified of that. But when your story is organized around shame, that's even worse because I'm not enough just being who I am.
Yeah.
And that saying, happy is the man who can sit on the side of the river and simply fish, or the woman. I mean, just being present, and if you look at these great masters, they sit there in loincloths, right? With no clothes on, simply manifesting their heliotropic response to the light. They're becoming the light. That's enough. But not if your story is based on Western materialism and that consciousness of the mental world, right? It's enough for you know what? It's enough for a reptile. It's enough for a gecko just to be a gecko. It doesn't, because his story is not separate to the bigger story, right?
Indeed. So let's go on to Larry. Larry, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Thank you, Dr. Duffy. I was inspired by this conversation, and but I'm now questioning what is it that I really do. Now, I'm a piano player, and my job is going to assisted living communities and memory care units, and knowing what from a lifetime of piano bar, I know what songs resonate with them. I know what they remember. So I can walk in the room and look at that. I throw a blanket of fun over them, and they remember things. They remember words and stuff, and they all come up to me and tell me how amazing that was and the memories it triggered for them. And the staff comes up and says, you just can't believe what a difference this makes. And now I'm listening to this conversation and going, well, am I doing something medical here, or is there a way of describing this other than I played songs and people were happy?
Absolutely. So I think, first of all, what you're demonstrating is you're getting trapped by words, right? So that word medical, medicine it's a relatively recent idea, medicine. So, but absolutely, you're healing. And actually, I like to think, within the Tibetan tradition, they have 3 or 4 kind of levels of manifestation of consciousness in Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya, and then Sambhovakaya. Basically, Nirmanakaya just means the world of forms, that we live in a world of forms, right? That's how we're manifesting as forms. But above that, there is the world of patterns. And this is really the emanation, this is really the bliss body. It's how the ultimate energy of the Dharmakaya, the universal consciousness, whatever you want to call that. That's the first layer, and then that becomes manifest in these bliss forms, and then it becomes a physical form, right? So when the music of the spheres, I mean, this goes back. I mean, music, at least to me, is a manifestation of these patterns, these forms that extend beyond the limitations of our physical mentalizing, that they move us in ways in which we can't clearly conceptualize, right? So for somebody with dementia, the loss of their mental faculties, right, you're actually accessing their experience in a non-conceptual way that is profoundly healing for them, right? Because most of the time they're made to inhabit a world where they don't access any forms, any language, any concepts because of the limitations, and yet they're put in this sterile vacuum. In fact, most of the time it's full of really noxious patterns. Like, when I work in the hospital, I go to see people and they've got the television going on. They have Fox News full of anger and hatred and spewing things. And then they wonder why the patient is agitated. And I say, well, you look at our healthcare, our hospitals are designed to, they create patterns that are incredibly disruptive and uncomfortable. And sometimes we need those disruptions to get out of our forms, but not when you have dementia. So you're doing something, you are a healer, and music is healing, right? It's a very powerful form of healing. In all the spiritual traditions, music is central to that. I mean, within Hinduism, within Sufism, within Tibetan, the chanting, the mantras are a form, right? You say mantras, it's a form. So you're really giving people a doorway out of the vacuum that's left when they have no conceptual capacity anymore. And they're actually free. They're actually free, but nobody's giving them permission to be happy, right? I mean, if you think about it, I mean, unless they have physical discomfort or they're living in a horrible environment, most people with dementia or they're depressed, because people can get depressed, they're actually quite content. I mean, they're really peaceful. So you are probably the most powerful healing modality they're experiencing, and you are far more effective than the drugs like memantine and Aricept and all that stuff we give people. That really doesn't do anything. And there was a movement in this country for a while to create healing environments, the plane tree model that was based on, trying to replicate nature within a healing system like a hospital. And we actually started here in Connecticut down the road from where I am now. Unfortunately, it's basically collapsed, and the hospitals will give lip service to it, but they're really not, because they're so terrified of germs and things. And but even though the data shows that a natural environment has less germs, bacteria than a sterile one. So please don't lose faith in your healing, and don't try to measure yourself within the right upper quadrant, okay? You are living in the left lower quadrant and the left upper quadrant.
Okay.
Right, you see that? Right, and that's where your particular patients are living. Now, I wouldn't recommend that you try to force your way into the trauma department and say, listen, I want to tell the surgeon to get out of the way who's fixing the fractured hip, and say, I'm going to start playing some, because it's like the ultimate music of the spheres, right? No, you're not going to do that, and that's the power of integral, is that it helps understand, who gets what, when, how often, how do you measure, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
so
Thank you so much. That's been very informative and expanded my picture of what I do. Thank you.
And just get rid of that shame virus that you've obviously got it too.
Okay.
so
Thanks.
Jim,
Take a look at that one. Yep, we've all got it.
Jim,
Okay.
just a very short note for people who don't know what Dharmakaya is. So in integral theory, they would also be called the causal realm. So, and are you okay to go on for a little bit so we can get to Wheaton's question?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Your message is beautiful, and the way you deliver it is so genuine that is huge. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us and to share. I want to get to your, well, I have a question about the last point you made. I'm trying to understand some of the ramifications and the causes of the craziness of political collisions taking place in America. And I understand things like greed, and I understand jealousy and envy and all that stuff. But you've mentioned a number of times, and just did again with Larry, how shame may be critical to our being manipulated. And I'd like to know more about how that manifests itself. How do you see that? How would we feel that? How would we know that? How do you?
Right. So, I mean, okay. So, sometimes I think I'm just become a shame doctor. To be honest, I think I first recognized shame within myself, and I mean, consciously recognize it I was in San Francisco probably 7, 8 years ago, maybe even before that, 10 years ago. So basically everybody that walks in my room has the shame virus. And so what is shame? Shame is really, it's a mindset that shapes our experience of ourselves. So shame is not an emotion. Shame is not a physical state. It's a perspective of ourselves. All right. So, and basically what that perspective is that I cannot trust myself. I cannot therefore take authority over myself and my experiences, because inherently I believe that they are not trustworthy. So how does this manifest at an individual is that they, Brene Brown, who's wonderful, Brene took shame out of the closet about 15 years ago. Brene says that when shame is driving the car, perfectionism is riding shotgun, and perfectionism is in the passenger seat, and anger is riding shotgun. So shame's driving, perfectionism in the passenger seat, anger is riding shotgun. So what does that manifest as? Well, So when I don't trust myself, I inherently believe that I am not enough. And the only way I can ever prove that I'm enough is by being perfect. And I need to get validation of that perfection from outside people because I can't trust my own perspective of it. And therefore, I will work incredibly hard to get that feedback from people, okay, from the system. And anger is a very, we have tremendous anger ourselves because we feel like we're failing. And we also have anger towards the system that doesn't recognize, like my mother doesn't recognize my inherent pristine perfection, right? I have anger towards her or my parents. So we have perfectionism, anger. Now, within Chinese medicine, that concept of anger, anger has got a Western connotation of being destructive, but actually within Chinese medicine, anger is a powerful force of creativity. It's the wood element. It's what generates creativity. So you take perfectionism, energy, and creativity, and you put them in if you put them in San Francisco, in Silicon Valley, it's a really effective way to get ahead. Think about our lives. You have to be perfect. You have to get 100% in your things. You have to get into the right college. You have to get the right job. And then what they do is they even gamify. Gamify it. So now we have all of these metrics. I used to get a metrics every 3 months about maybe 100 different metrics. And one of them was, how compassionate do my patients think I am? Scale of 0 to 10. Now, if I saw 400 people in that 3 months, maybe 5 would fill out the questionnaire. And those 5, one might be wanting to really give me a good thing. Other 4 were pissed off for some reason. Often just pissed off with the system that didn't let them have the medication they wanted or give them ketamine because they thought they would like to try it out just for fun, right? Whatever. So then I get on my metrics, you now rank out of 500 physicians, you rank number 373rd in terms of your compassion, all right? So no matter what, if I came out number 1 out of 400, that was also a very bad thing because they were going to come back in 3 months and give me another score, and I might drop 100 points, 100 positions. So now I'm super anxious because I can't, so they're gamifying me. They're gamifying shame. And so I think we need to get rid of, there's a wonderful iconoclastic organizational theorist, Carol Sanborn, who's wonderful. She has a podcast. She's older now, and I think she stopped. But anyway, she talks about, get rid of metrics. Okay, we need to get rid of these metrics because they're gamifying shame to control us. Okay, and then when you go for your review, there's 100 metrics that you could be evaluated on, and then your reviewer will pick the one which they can get the most shame out of you. Or do you know that you actually are in the lowest quadrant when it comes to the time it takes to respond to your emails, right? So I went through that. And remember my last one, I knew I was leaving. I said, okay. I said, so give me the metrics, because I stopped opening them after the first time. I'm not opening these. I said, if I've done something bad enough, they're going to contact me. So why bother? I said, I want to look at the metrics. And I said, so let me look at them. He said, why? I said, I want to see all of these things. He said, you don't look at them? I said, no, but I want to see them now. So on one of them, I was number 1 out of 500. I said, so why not let's talk about number 1? That's something I do well. Maybe I can help do it better, help other people. No. We're here to talk about your thing. So shame. So shame is in the drinking water. It paralyzes us. It's our original sin. And within the monotheistic traditions, of course, it is inescapable. It's the curse of Adam and Eve. And even if I go to confession and get baptized and whatever, it's still there. It's a patina that's never going to go away. All right. So
Jim, can I ask you, can you give us one practical action step that people can take to, for instance, navigate this shame dynamic?
Sure. Okay. First of all, just become self-aware. Now, that's the entry point into all of these non-conceptual practices. Become self-aware. We call it mindfulness. That's one name. We become self-aware. Just people are absolutely, you can see them when I bring this up in my work with my patients. What do you mean? And I said, let's just sit for a moment, and I do a little exercise. I said, I want you just to repeat to yourself out loud, may I be happy? May I be happy? May I be happy? Okay, may I be happy? May I be happy? Okay, so what came up for you? Well, what do you mean? So what did you become aware of when you said that? Well, I kind of felt comfortable in my stomach here, right? Or I find it hard. I found it hard just to say that. It seemed kind of selfish, you know? Or maybe I don't know, why am I saying this? You know, it's like, what is this guy talk? Why do you want this guy's a kook, this psychiatrist. He's like saying, may I be happy, right? So just be aware, okay? And it's hard to be aware, it's painful. And then what we do is a very, very practical thing. We just do self-compassion practice. And so if we, and the Buddhist tradition is full of these self-compassion practices from may I be happy is a starting point in self-compassion. It's a skill. We have to retrain our brains. Remember I said it's a metacognitive mindset. We actually have to retrain it. It's really hard because we have how many thoughts a day? 40,000 thoughts. And it's like we do this 40,000 times. It's really hard. So that's where suffering comes in. You say, you know what? I'm so tired of suffering. I don't want to do this anymore. So I'm going to try what this guy said. I'm going to just, and you can go on Krista Neff out of University of Texas, and Austin's done a wonderful job of kind of repackaging these in a Western concept, self-compassion.org. And she has everything from a 45-second practice to literally an hour. And that's your practice. You're recoding your metacognitive software. Now that sounds weird. How can it be metacognitive software? But you're recoding it, right? This is laying on top of our default mode story, right? You just keep doing that, and you keep doing it, and you keep doing it. And then suddenly, oh, may I be happy? And there's not that little virus, is no, who are you to be happy? Or your mother said you never amount to anything, or whatever, right? Well, this guy's an idiot, the psychiatrist. Why doesn't he just give me drugs and I can be happy, right? So it's these practices, these contemplative skills, they're very, 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 very practical and very challenging because they mean changing these patterns. Human beings are just a series of patterns, right? So you can go on self-compassion.org, you can read Brene Brown, you can read Pema Chodron, you can read Sharon Salzberg. You just Google self-compassion, you'll find it there. And this is the beginning and the end of everything. There's this practice, right? Remember I said, so it's, yeah, okay. So is that kind of, to go back to Wheaton, I want to get back to the politics because I think this is interesting. So, and I know Ken talks about this a lot and I can't compete in any way with his brilliance about, but what I would say is what we are witnessing is, there's two key messages for me in what we're witnessing. The first one is simpler. We're witnessing the power of shamelessness in a shameful world. We have a leader in my country who is completely shameless. All right? It's remarkable. Totally shameless. And how empowering is it for him? Because nothing sticks. Because he's got his agenda and nothing gets in the way, right? And he also happens to have an incredible amount of vitality, which is another interesting question. If any of you are interested in exploring that, I recommend you watch this season's South Park, the comedy series on television. But anyway, they'll give you a metaphor for that. But anyway, so shamelessness is an incredibly powerful thing, and it's why sociopaths, for example, can control large groups, right? Because they consciously know that they're really dealing with paralyzed people who will do anything to try to escape their own paralysis induced by shamelessness. The other thing that I think that we're witnessing, and actually this goes back to Gebser and Integral, is I think what we're witnessing is the breakdown of these mental structures, which in politics we call right and left, Democratic, Republican, Labor, Conservative, whatever, right? We're actually seeing the breakdown, the inevitable breakdown of these mentally constructed perspectives. We're seeing the breakdown of the whole thing. Everything's breaking down. And so we're seeing the breakdown of our political models and what we're seeing now, and the breakdown of our financial models, the currency that drives these mental models is breaking down. And so smarter people than me would suggest that what we're seeing is the rise of the next empire. I mean, many empires have all come and gone, right? But we just very recently, of course, we had the British Empire. You guys had your empire, and it dissolved. It was overtaken by the American Empire, right? And very similar. But what they did was they basically exported entropy of labor and energy to make themselves more efficient, right? And now we have the evolution of the next empire, which is living in a virtual world. Okay, and I would say a potentially integral world that's actually being shaped by what we are calling artificial intelligence. And within that world, you'll become a citizen of that world by virtue of your ability to understand how to work within those non-mental forms, and to work with a currency like Bitcoin, that will be beyond the fiat currencies and will not be held hostage to that. So I think what we're seeing now is a breakdown of these mentally constructed political systems. And you can go through history, and each of Gebser's 5 levels are manifested in the organization of their societies, right? So I think we're seeing that what a fabulous time to be alive, to be witnessing this emergence. And and then the good news, for me and for most of our group, except for a few, I won't go through it. We're kind of at that point where our own longevity is being, we're questioning that, right? We suddenly realize, oh, life isn't permanent. But actually, it's looking like that if you can make the next 5 years, you can probably live another 150 years based on what's happening in the biological sciences. So the rodents are currently living to equivalent of 250 years in the Harvard labs. And actually, as of last week, AI just a dedicated mono AI system out of ChatGPT actually discovered 10 more proteins that can actually influence the aging clock, the Yamanaka clock. So we're actually going to see not only can we slow aging down, we actually have the data to suggest we can reverse aging. So for Suzanne and for me, the question is, well, how old do you want to be? Do you want to be a 25-year-old person going into postgrad? You want to be, it's going to be interesting. So what an amazing time. And actually what we're witnessing as we move into these integral consciousnesses, we're moving beyond space and time. That's what we're talking about, right? And that's actually my big fascination these days. Of course, Kala Chakra, the wheel of time, the technology of time. It's actually a model of how we move beyond the constraints of time. And we can actually talk about each of these 5 Gebser structures in terms of their relationship to creating the experience of space and time, right? So I hope that's very encouraging for all of us, is that, Suzanne, we may be retired, but, we may be making a comeback. We'll come back as nobody. Kalu Rinpoche, who says, by becoming nothing, I become everything, and becoming everything, I become nothing, and that is all there is. So that's all we're talking about, right? Kalu Rinpoche, K-A-L-U. Within the healing traditions, because what we're talking about today, I have found the most inspiration for this map in Chiron. Chiron, the Greek mythological healing god, who actually within his story outlines the entire path. The entire path, Gebser's 5 stages or structures everything is laid out in Chiron. And what's interesting is that 1970, I'm going to say 78, they actually discovered Chiron. Astrologers had knew there was something out there, but nobody could see it. And then in Pasadena, they actually discovered Chiron, the planetoid. And Chiron lives in that space between the known and the unknown, between language and the ineffable. And so we've actually moved into that period. And we're now moving beyond Chiron into his spouse, his consort Chariklos, who embodies wisdom, female wisdom, who's now also being discovered. And now they're discovering that hundreds of these planets that are now manifesting in our telescopes. And so we're in this incredible time of discovery, and but we can't let fear and shame hold us back. You guys all know about the Mayan calendar, right? And of course, everybody in 2011, right? Everybody thought the world had come to an end, and I think it was in March, and everybody was like waiting, 12 o'clock, everything was going to end, and of course it didn't end. Everybody said, "Oh, well, that proves the Mayan calendar is complete rubbish." They didn't know what they were talking about. But Carl Kallerman, who's a wonderful scholar of the calendar, he was a PhD immunologist, spent his life now studying the calendar, has outlined the calendar as consisting, I think, of 13 baktuns or eras of time. And each of these eras describes a form of consciousness as it evolves, starting from, pre-microbial forms up into really a very good description of contemporary society prior to what we're going through now is different. And actually, what Kellerman says is the calendar didn't predict the end of time. It just said that we can't describe whatever's happening after that date, 2011, right? So that was interesting to me. It's like, wow, I mean, what happened? So I went back and I actually asked AI. I said, AI, please tell me of anything scientifically significant that happened in that year. And it came up with a bunch of things, but there was one thing, was that there were two researchers who published a paper that demonstrated that graphic chips that they use in video games, graphic chips were capable of identifying different cats. Seems kind of silly, right? But actually that came out of the NVIDIA world. And what they did was they were moving from linear, what they were suggesting is that we can move from simple linear reasoning, large language models, into patterns. Okay. And that's what, of course, NVIDIA is, that's what's made NVIDIA what it is. And so what I would suggest is that the Mayans predicted that suddenly something would manifest that would change our understanding of who we are, moving out of linear patterns into shapes, okay, patterns. And that, of course, is Plato's forms, right? That the universe is really moving into these Platonic forms. And actually, there is now work within biology that actually is beginning to suggest that the future of medicine will lie in being able to create or recreate or enhance these Platonic forms. And so yeah, I could go on and on. But anyway, it's an incredible time to be alive. And actually, I interviewed a wonderful guy who was one of the first people to bring Chinese medicine to America. And he's been practicing the medicine for 60 years. And I asked him, what is the most important thing you've learned about the medicine? And he says, the most important thing is that we should experience our life to be an adventure. Very interesting, right?
Absolutely.
That's what I'm talking about here, is that we're moving into forms, shapes beyond our conceptual limitations of our mental world into something that transcends that. And it's an adventure. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So Jim, it's wonderful. And indeed, let's see. Normally you had something to close with?
Yeah, well, this has been just such an incredible discussion. Thank you, Dr. Duffy, for spending all this time with us. And it would have been lovely if we could have involved all of you. And I'm sure many of you might have had questions, but I think this is perhaps a good time to close. You're such an embodiment, Dr. Duffy, of sort of the dancing with the polarity of the head and the heart, and really bringing those, privileging both, and of course the body being the one that is ultimately, served. Yeah, so thank you so much again. If you ever felt like coming back to talk with us, we would welcome you, Dr. Duffy. And I think we'll have so much more questions as well. I have so many more questions, but it seems like this is a good time to close. And I thought in closing, perhaps I offer this to you, Dr. Duffy, for the incredible work that you have done, but also to each one of us, as those of us who are committed to continuing that conversation, just keeping this conversation going. This is a little bit of writing that for some reason, probably around 1998, which is when I first read Wilber's book, One Taste, I typed this little bit from this book out, and I have always had it somehow. I still have it in 2025 on whatever table I use as my regular desk. So maybe this might sound a little extreme for some of you. Take it as you want to, whichever way, but we'll close with this. No matter that lesser motivations will dog your path, no matter that anger and envy, shame and pity, pride and prejudice will remind you daily of how much you can always grow. Still and still, under it all, around it all, above it all, the heartbeat of compassion will resound. A constant cloud of caring will rain on your every parade, and you will be driven, in the best sense of the word, by this ruthless taskmaster, but only because you, eons ago, made a secret promise to let this motivation rule you until all souls are set free in this ocean of infinity. Because of compassion, you will strive harder. Because of compassion, you will get straight. Because of compassion, you will work your fingers to the bone, push at the world until you literally bleed, toil until the tears strain your vision, struggle until life itself runs dry. And in the deepest, deepest center of your heart, the world is already thanking you. So, thank you, everyone.